This isn't just another rookie quarterback controversy, and it's definitely not the kind of story that fades after a bad preseason game. What's unfolding right now feels different, heavier, like something the league usually handles quietly behind closed doors, but suddenly can't control anymore. Because when a rookie walks into the NFL and the conversation shifts from football to character, from development to dismissal, and from evaluation to quiet exclusion, that's when alarms start going off. And in this case, they're getting louder by the day. At the center of that noise is Shedeur Sanders, a young quarterback who entered the league with talent, confidence, and one of the most recognizable last names in football. Expectations were always going to be high. Pressure was guaranteed. Scrutiny was part of the deal. But what no one expected was how fast the tone would turn, or how personal the coverage would become before he ever got a real chance to show what he could do on an NFL field. This didn't feel like normal rookie criticism. It felt like a decision had already been made. Because when you step back and look at the headlines, the conversations, and the way his name has been framed, something starts to feel off. This wasn't just about mechanics or learning a playbook. Suddenly, stories were surfacing that focused on injuries instead of upside, on minor off-field issues instead of on-field development. Small, forgettable moments were magnified and repackaged as warning signs. And instead of being discussed like a young quarterback learning the league, Sanders was being talked about like a problem that needed to be managed, or worse, like a mistake that needed to be erased quietly. That's where this story stops being about one player and starts becoming about power. Because narratives don't shape themselves in the NFL. They're built, reinforced, and repeated until they become accepted truth. And once that happens, talent stops mattering as much as perception. The scary part isn't the criticism itself. The scary part is how coordinated it all begins to feel when coaching decisions, media framing, and access to opportunity all start pointing in the same direction. Normally, this is where the league stays quiet. Normally, the NFL lets teams handle it, lets media voices do what they do, and lets rookies either survive the pressure or disappear under it. Intervention isn't the league's style. Silence usually is. Which is why this moment caught everyone off guard. Because when whispers turned into backlash and fans started asking uncomfortable questions, someone at the very top finally stepped in and said, "Enough." That someone was Roger Goodell, and no matter how you feel about him, that alone is a huge deal. Commissioners don't wade into media narratives, they don't publicly challenge how players are being discussed, and they definitely don't hint at internal accountability over how a rookie is being developed. That's not how this league has operated for decades. But this time, the usual playbook got tossed aside. Because at its core, this situation isn't just about a quarterback learning the pro game. It's about how quickly a system can decide who belongs and who doesn't. It's about who gets patience and who gets labeled. And it's about how those labels tend to stick hardest to certain players, no matter how much promise they show. For years, fans have argued that some quarterbacks are allowed to struggle, while others are written off at the first sign of resistance. This moment has dragged that argument out of comment sections and straight into the league office. And that's why people are paying attention. Because when the commissioner of the NFL breaks character and starts pushing back, it signals that something deeper is at play. This isn't about protecting feelings, it's about protecting process, about questioning whether development is actually fair or quietly selective, about whether the stories told about young players are helping them grow or sealing their fate before they ever take a meaningful snap. What makes this even more explosive is timing. This is happening before a full body of NFL work exists, before definitive proof, before the usual wait-and-see period has even had time to breathe, which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If this is how things look at the very beginning, what would the end have looked like if no one stepped in? That's what has fans split, media defensive, and league insiders uneasy. Because once you start pulling on this thread, it's hard to ignore where it leads. Coaching decisions that quietly limit opportunity, coverage that drifts from analysis to judgment, and a system that has historically struggled to admit when bias, even unintentional, shapes outcomes. This isn't a headline built on one bad week or one bad throw. It's a slow-burning conflict between perception and potential. And the truth is, this story is just getting started. Because what happens next doesn't just affect Shedeur Sanders, it affects every young quarterback watching how this plays out. It affects how coaches think about development when the spotlight isn't flattering. And it forces the league to answer a question it's been able to dodge for years. Is the NFL really a meritocracy, or does the story get written long before the results ever do? And once you see how the pieces connect, it's impossible to unsee it. The first thing people noticed wasn't a bad game or a disastrous practice clip, it was the tone. One week, Shedeur Sanders was being discussed like a high-upside rookie with tools worth developing. The next, the conversation had shifted into something colder and more personal. The language changed, the patience disappeared, and suddenly, coverage that should have been about growth and adjustment started reading like a teardown. Fans didn't need insider access to feel it. You could hear it in the phrasing, see it in the headlines, and feel it in what people were choosing to highlight. Instead of breaking down footwork or decision-making, stories began circling around injuries in a way that felt less informative and more dismissive. Instead of treating minor off-field issues like the forgettable footnotes they usually are for rookies, they were framed as symbols, hints that something was wrong. Reports and commentary stopped sounding neutral. They started sounding conclusive, like the verdict had already been reached. And the unsettling part was how fast that shift happened, before Sanders ever had a real runway to prove or disprove anything on an NFL field. That's when fans started asking questions, because criticism is normal in this league. Nobody's asking for softness, but there's a clear difference between evaluating a player and quietly constructing a narrative around them. And in Sanders' case, many felt that narrative was getting shaped around everything except football. Small details were inflated, context was stripped away, and repetition did the rest. When the same talking points get echoed enough times, they start to feel like fact, even if they're built on almost nothing. What really set off alarms was the consistency. Different outlets, similar framing. Different voices, same conclusion. This wasn't just one harsh columnist or one frustrated reporter, it felt like a pattern. According to online discussion and media observers, the criticism wasn't evolving the way it usually does with rookies. Normally, the story adjusts as practices stack up and roles become clearer. Here, the judgment seemed frozen in place, like no amount of progress would have mattered. That's when people stopped calling it rough coverage and started calling it something else entirely. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Fans were watching other rookie quarterbacks get time, patience, benefit of the doubt. Struggles were reframed as learning moments. Mistakes were labeled part of the process. With Sanders, the lens felt narrower, sharper, less forgiving. Each mention carried an edge, as if the story needed him to fall in line with an image that had already been sketched out. To many, it looked less like analysis and more like positioning, setting expectations low enough that disappointment would feel inevitable. The pushback didn't start on TV panels or radio shows. It started online, in comment sections, forums, social clips, and fan breakdowns. People began comparing headlines, lining up quotes, pointing out how quickly the conversation had jumped from project to problem. And the more they looked, the more obvious it seemed. This wasn't organic skepticism building over time. It was a sudden pivot, and it happened so early that it raised the biggest red flag of all. Why now? Because in the NFL, timing tells you everything. When narratives harden before opportunity exists, they don't just reflect opinions, they influence outcomes. Coaches hear it, executives hear it, teammates hear it. And once that kind of perception takes hold, it can quietly limit chances long before a depth chart ever makes it official. That's why the media shift around Sanders mattered so much. It wasn't loud outrage. It was a controlled hum, steady enough to normalize the idea that he didn't belong in the conversation at all. And that's when this stopped being about clicks and commentary, because when enough people start noticing the same directional push, it forces a harder question into the open. Was this just unusually harsh coverage, or was it part of something bigger that usually stays hidden unless someone pulls the curtain back? The answer to that question didn't come from the media. It came from what was happening next, far away from microphones and headlines, on the practice field itself. What made the media shift even more troubling was what reportedly happened away from the cameras. Because once fans started looking past headlines and into how Shedeur Sanders was actually being handled day to day, the football side of the story raised just as many questions as the coverage ever did. This is where development either happens or quietly gets stalled. And according to multiple reports and observations from camp watchers, Sanders' path didn't look like a normal rookie quarterback learning curve at all. In the NFL, practice reps are everything. They're the currency of development. First-team reps are where timing gets built, where quarterbacks learn how fast windows really close, where trust with receivers and linemen starts to form. And for rookie QBs, especially ones coming into complex systems, those reps aren't a luxury, they're a necessity. That's why eyebrows went up when reports began circulating that Sanders wasn't getting meaningful work with the starters. Instead of rotating in or slowly being tested, he was placed primarily on the scout team. On paper, that might sound harmless. Every rookie spends time there. But in reality, the scout team isn't designed to grow your skills. It's designed to copy someone else's. You're running another team's offense, mimicking tendencies, throwing passes that don't reflect your strengths, all for the sake of preparing the starters. It's repetition without progression. It keeps you busy, but it doesn't move you forward. And when a quarterback stays there too long, it quietly limits what they're allowed to show. According to reports, that's exactly what frustrated people watching this situation. Sanders wasn't being eased in. He wasn't being evaluated against the first unit in meaningful stretches. He was being contained. And once that happens, the narrative writes itself. No chemistry with starters becomes he's not connecting. No first-team reps turn into he's not ready. Developmental decisions start looking like performance judgments, even though the opportunity to perform was never really there.
Eyebrows. Hits that lingered just long enough to make people watching wonder why no one was stepping in. Not because practices can't be physical, but because quarterbacks almost never absorb that kind of wear without someone shutting it down. Yet, in these accounts, the moment passed. No flags, no visible correction, no public acknowledgement that something wasn't right. That silence mattered. Because when a player takes repeated hits in practice and nothing changes, it sends a message. It tells defenders how far they can go. It tells the quarterback where he stands. And it tells everyone watching that protection isn't a priority. Whether intentional or not, that kind of environment chips away at confidence fast. You stop playing loose. You stop trusting the system around you. And for a rookie quarterback still finding his footing, that can be devastating. What made this even more troubling was how easily it fit into the larger pattern: limited reps, scout team confinement, and now an apparent lack of intervention when physical boundaries blurred. To critics and fans alike, it didn't feel like isolated incidents. It felt like alignment. Each decision on its own could be explained away. Together, they painted a picture that was hard to ignore. One where Sanders wasn't just developing slowly, but was being left exposed without meaningful upside in return. Of course, none of this was officially addressed at the time. No press conference, no clarification, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. And in the NFL, silence always creates space for speculation. Fans filled in the gaps, analysts began whispering, and the idea that this wasn't just mismanagement, but a breakdown in accountability started gaining traction. Because protecting your quarterback is one of the most basic responsibilities in football. When that protection feels inconsistent, it raises questions far beyond scheme or competition. What really unsettled people was how normalized it appeared to be. According to those following closely, this wasn't treated as a problem that needed fixing. It was just absorbed into the routine. And when something dangerous becomes routine, it stops feeling like an accident. That's the moment when trust erodes, not just between player and coach, but between organization and public perception. This is where the narrative began shifting from, "Is this rookie developing slowly?" to, "What kind of environment is he actually in?" Because development without safety isn't development at all, it's attrition. And once that perception sets in, it changes how every prior decision gets reinterpreted. The limited reps, the harsh coverage, the lack of advocacy, suddenly, all of it felt connected. And while this was unfolding on the field, something else was accelerating just as fast off of it. Because as these reports circulated quietly among fans, the media conversation didn't slow down, it intensified. And instead of pulling back, certain voices leaned in even harder, pushing narratives that would soon cross a line many believe should never be crossed. By the time questions about safety and development began circulating, the story around Shedeur Sanders had already slipped into a different phase. This wasn't just coverage anymore, it was momentum. Because in the NFL, once perception starts moving faster than facts, it becomes its own force. And for a young quarterback without real game film to fall back on, that can be lethal to a career before it ever really begins. The most damaging part wasn't one headline or one harsh quote, it was repetition. When the same themes keep showing up from different outlets in slightly different words, they start to feel less like opinions and more like consensus. Sanders wasn't being discussed as a developmental player anymore. He was being framed as a distraction, a question mark, a problem that needed.
What made it worse was the context. This wasn't a late-round flyer buried behind a locked-in franchise quarterback. This was a rookie with pedigree, college production, and obvious upside. The expectation around the league is that players like that at least get a window, a phase where coaches gather real information. Instead, according to those following camp closely, Sanders' role stayed frozen while others continued to rotate and test their limits. And that's where doubts started creeping in, not just from fans, but from former players and analysts watching how the process was unfolding. Because here's the quiet truth about development in the NFL. If you don't get reps, you don't get rhythm. If you don't get rhythm, you look hesitant. And if you look hesitant in the rare moments you do get noticed, it becomes proof that the original decision was right. It's a loop that's hard to break once it starts. A quarterback doesn't fail in public, he just slowly disappears from the conversation, replaced by assumptions instead of tape. And all of this was allegedly happening within the structure of the Cleveland Browns, a franchise that has spent years searching for stability at the quarterback position. That's part of what confused people the most. When you're a team that knows how fragile the position is, why would you limit evaluation this early? Why wouldn't you want as much information as possible, especially from a young arm with clear potential? Those questions didn't have clear answers, and the silence around them only made things louder. As this went on, fans began connecting dots, media voices calling him unready, practice usage reinforcing that idea, and no visible push to challenge the narrative from inside the building. According to online discussion, it felt less like competition and more like quiet compartmentalization, like Sanders had been placed into a box before the season even had a chance to breathe. And once a rookie quarterback gets boxed in, it's incredibly hard to fight your way out. That's why this section of the story matters so much, because media narratives can be argued against, but practice decisions, those shape reality. They dictate who improves, who struggles, and who gets labeled before the public ever sees enough to judge fairly. And in Sanders' case, the gap between expectations and opportunity was becoming impossible to ignore. And then things escalated even further, because it wasn't just about reps anymore. Reports began surfacing about what those practices looked like physically and whether the environment itself was protecting the quarterback at all. As the questions around development grew louder, another layer of concern quietly surfaced, one that had nothing to do with playbooks or depth charts.
According to reports and accounts shared by those watching practices closely, Shedeur Sanders wasn't just stuck in a holding pattern, he was absorbing physical punishment in an environment where protection felt optional, and that's where the conversation took a much darker turn. In NFL practices, especially when it comes to quarterbacks, there's an unspoken understanding. You can compete, you can pressure, but you don't cross certain lines. Quarterbacks are protected for a reason. They're the most exposed position on the field, and teams know an injury in practice can derail an entire season. That's why defenders are usually pulled off, whistles come fast, and coaches step in the moment things get excessive. That safeguard is part of the system, or at least it's supposed to be. According to multiple reports and online discussion, that safeguard didn't seem to apply consistently here. Sanders, running scout team looks, was allegedly taking unnecessary contact, hits that raised explanation. And when that happens early, it doesn't matter how unproven those ideas are. They stick because there's nothing visible to counter them. That's how narrative control works in professional sports. If you control the framing, you control the conversation. And in this case, the conversation kept drifting further away from football. According to critics of the coverage, minor injuries weren't just updates, they were punchlines. Small off-field matters weren't context, they were elevated into character clues. Even the lack of reps became ammunition, twisted into proof that Sanders wasn't trusted, rather than examined as a decision that deserved scrutiny itself. What made this especially troubling was how one-sided it felt. Other rookies struggled, and it was called growing pains. Sanders struggled for opportunity, and it was framed as a reflection of who he was, not the situation he was in. That difference matters because narratives don't just influence fans, they influence locker rooms, they influence executives, and they absolutely influence how long a young quarterback is allowed to stay in the conversation. There's a brutal truth about being a quarterback in the NFL. If people decide you're not it, you don't always get a chance to prove them wrong. You just get fewer snaps, fewer reps, fewer defenders in your corner, and then the lack of opportunity becomes the evidence used against you. That's the trap. Once perception turns, everything you do or don't do is filtered through it. According to fan-driven breakdowns and online commentary, this looked less like organic skepticism and more like story building. Certain media voices weren't waiting for new information, they were reinforcing the same take, week after week, regardless of changes on the field. And when coverage stops evolving, it stops being analysis, it becomes positioning, the kind that quietly tells an audience how to feel before they've had a chance to decide for themselves. This is where the word control becomes important, because when a player is locked out of real evaluation reps and simultaneously locked into a negative media frame, the game is rigged against him. There's no film to flip the script, no breakout moment to shift opinion, just silence on the field and noise everywhere else. That imbalance is what set this situation apart from normal rookie pressure. And fans noticed. They noticed how quickly Sanders was getting dismissed, how the language around him hardened while the evidence remained thin, how the burden of proof seemed higher, patience shorter, and benefit of the doubt completely absent. To many, it didn't feel like criticism meant to inform, it felt like a narrative meant to land. Once that realization spread, the conversation changed. People stopped debating throws and started debating fairness. They stopped asking if Sanders was ready and started asking who decided he wasn't. And that shift is dangerous for a league that depends on trust in its systems. Because when fans believe outcomes are being shaped before competition can play out, confidence in the product cracks. This wasn't just a perception battle Sanders was fighting, it was an entire machine of framing, repetition, and silence working in sync. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to dismiss as coincidence. At some point, someone with real authority had to decide whether this was just noise or whether it was a problem that needed to be addressed head-on. That's when the story took another sharp turn, because the next voice to step into this perception war wasn't a player or a pundit,
It was the one voice that almost never challenges how these stories get told.
Up until this point, everything about the situation followed a familiar script. Media narratives spiraled, coaching decisions stayed internal, players absorbed the consequences quietly, and the league office stayed out of it. That's how these stories usually end, not with answers, but with silence, which is exactly why what happened next sent shockwaves through the football world. Because this time, the silence broke, and it broke from the very top. According to reports, Roger Goodell didn't just take note of what was happening around Shedeur Sanders, he took issue with it. And that alone is extraordinary. Commissioners don't involve themselves in player development debates. They don't push back on media framing, and they certainly don't hint at accountability inside a team's coaching structure over how a rookie is being handled. For decades, the league's approach has been distance and deniability. This was the opposite. What made Goodell's response so jarring wasn't just that he spoke up, it was how directly he did it. Reports suggest he wasn't focused on one bad article or one heated take. He was looking at the pattern, the alignment between limited opportunity, harsh coverage, and the way perception around Sanders had hardened almost overnight. From the league's perspective, that combination raised red flags, not about performance, but about process. And once the process itself gets questioned, neutrality becomes impossible to maintain. This was especially unexpected because Goodell is not known for rocking the boat when it comes to media voices. Historically, the commissioner's office has benefited from press relationships, not challenged them. Media outlets help shape the league's image. They amplify storylines. They sell the product. Going against that system is risky, and Goodell has spent much of his tenure avoiding that exact kind of risk, which is why this moment caught everyone off guard. According to those familiar with the situation, Goodell viewed what was happening as bigger than one rookie quarterback. This wasn't about protecting a name or responding to fan outrage. It was about whether the league was allowing narratives to override fair evaluation, especially at the most important position in football. When coverage stops reflecting reality and starts influencing opportunity, the integrity of competition gets compromised. That's not a media issue anymore. That's a league issue. What really escalated the situation was the reported scope of Goodell's concern. This wasn't limited to commentary, it extended to how Sanders was being developed, or more accurately, how he wasn't. When a commissioner starts asking questions about practice reps, player safety, and whether a coaching environment is equitable, it signals something serious. That level of scrutiny almost never happens unless the league believes there's a risk of long-term damage, not just to a player, but to its credibility. For fans, this was a stunning reversal. The same league often criticized for staying silent during uncomfortable moments was suddenly confronting one head-on. And for people inside the NFL, it was unsettling, because if the commissioner is willing to challenge media narratives and internal team decisions here, it raises an uncomfortable possibility that the old protections, the quiet understandings, the idea that some things stay behind closed doors may no longer apply. This was Goodell stepping out of his usual role as rule enforcer and into something closer to a referee of fairness. And whether you see that as overdue or dangerous depends on where you're standing. To supporters of Sanders, it felt like long-awaited recognition that something was wrong. To critics, it felt like overreach, but either way, it marked a clear break from the past.
Because once the league office acknowledges that perception can be weaponized and that silence can enable it, there's no going back. This wasn't a statement buried in legal language or a vague promise to monitor the situation. It was a signal that the NFL was done pretending these dynamics didn't exist. And that decision had consequences far beyond one player. The moment Goodell stepped in, the story changed shape. What had been framed as a rookie struggling to find his place was suddenly being examined as a systemic problem. And once that door opened, it didn't just invite questions about Shedeur Sanders, it forced the league, the teams, and the media to confront a history they'd long been able to sidestep. Once the commissioner stepped in, the conversation could no longer hide behind one player or one situation. Because the moment authority acknowledges a pattern, it automatically forces a look backward. And that's the part of this story a lot of people are uncomfortable with. Not because it's new, but because it's familiar. This didn't start with one rookie, one camp, or one media cycle. It sits on top of decades of history that the league has never fully reconciled. For a long time, black quarterbacks were never evaluated on the same terms as their peers. The language alone tells the story. Words like raw, athletic, or not cerebral enough were treated as scouting shorthand, but they carried weight. Meanwhile, similar flaws in other quarterbacks were reframed as upside or room to grow. Leadership was questioned more aggressively, mistakes were remembered longer, and patience, the most valuable resource a young quarterback can receive, was always shorter. Even as the league evolved and more black quarterbacks succeeded at the highest level, the scrutiny never really disappeared. It just got quieter, less overt, more coded. System fit, football IQ, comfort in the pocket. These phrases sound neutral, but they often determine who gets time and who gets replaced. And when those judgments happen early, before a quarterback has stable coaching or consistent reps, they become self-fulfilling. Failure isn't predicted, it's manufactured. That's why the Sanders situation struck such a nerve. To many fans, it wasn't shocking, it was recognizable. Another talented quarterback enters the league with hype, confidence, and expectations, only to find that the margin for error is razor thin. One misstep gets magnified, one setback becomes a label, and suddenly the burden of proof is entirely on the player to overcome circumstances that others are rarely asked to face. The hardest part to acknowledge is that this doesn't require malicious intent to be real. Bias doesn't always announce itself. It shows up in who gets a second chance, in who gets protected when things go wrong, in whose struggles are explained versus whose struggles are condemned. Over time, those small differences compound into massive career outcomes, and because they happen behind closed doors, they're easy to deny and hard to prove. That history is exactly what made this moment explosive, because once the league office acknowledged that Sanders might not be getting a fair developmental process, it implicitly acknowledged that similar things have happened before, that silence in the past may not have been neutrality, it may have been complicity. And that's a dangerous realization for any institution built on the promise of fairness in competition. Fans have been talking about this for years, on message boards, on social media, in comparisons that never quite make it into mainstream discussion. They've watched quarterbacks with worse numbers get endless opportunities, while others get quietly pushed aside. They've seen narratives harden
faster around certain players, regardless of effort or progress, and every time the league refused to engage with that conversation, mistrust grew. This is why the Sanders case didn't just spark debate, it reopened wounds. Because for people who've been watching closely, this wasn't an isolated oversight. It was another chapter in a book that's been written slowly, one decision at a time. And now, for the first time in a long while, that book was being read out loud by someone who couldn't be ignored. That doesn't mean everything suddenly changes. History doesn't unwind itself in one moment. But once it's acknowledged, it can't be pushed back into the shadows. The league is now being forced to answer questions it's avoided for generations about fairness, about opportunity, and about whether the systems in place truly give every quarterback an equal chance to succeed, or whether some are still fighting uphill before they ever take the field. And once those questions are asked publicly, they don't go away. They move forward, carried by fans who are no longer willing to accept easy explanations, carried by players who see themselves in the story, and carried by a league that now has to decide whether it's serious about change or just reacting to a moment it can't control. One of the most revealing parts of this entire situation wasn't what the media said, it was how fans responded to it. Because for the first time in a long while, the disconnect between mainstream coverage and public perception became impossible to ignore. Instead of accepting the narrative being pushed about Shedeur Sanders, fans pushed back, loudly. And that pushback didn't come from loyalty or blind optimism, it came from people paying closer attention than ever before. The way fans consume football has changed. They're not just relying on columns and sound bites anymore. They're watching practice clips, reviewing film breakdowns, tracking snap counts, and comparing how quarterbacks in similar situations are being treated. So when the coverage around Sanders turned harsh and dismissive before meaningful evidence existed, people noticed, not casually, but collectively. And once that awareness spread, the narrative started slipping out of the media's control. What made this different from past situations was scale. This wasn't one fan base defending its guy, it was a broader audience questioning why the conversation felt so one-sided. People began lining up examples, pointing out how other rookies were granted patience while Sanders was being written off. They highlighted the difference in tone, the choice of words, the lack of balance. And instead of fading, those criticisms gained traction, reshared and repeated until they reached critical mass. That shift matters because media influence only works when the audience buys in. For years, fans trusted that coverage, even when it was uncomfortable, was rooted in fair evaluation. This time, many weren't convinced. They sensed that the story was being shaped more aggressively than the facts allowed. And once that trust cracks, it's hard to rebuild. Because fans don't just consume narratives anymore, they interrogate them. According to online sentiment, the more aggressively certain voices doubled down, the more support Sanders gained. The attempt to frame him as a problem backfired. Instead of shrinking, his backing grew louder and more defiant. People weren't just defending a player, they were rejecting a process they felt was stacked against him. And in doing so, they reclaimed some control over the conversation. This is the part the league can't ignore. Media no longer holds a monopoly on interpretation. When fans see repetition without evolution, criticism without context, and judgment without opportunity,
They respond. And that response doesn't stay contained to comment sections. It bleeds into national conversations, into league offices, into sponsorship optics. In today's NFL, perception is a two-way street, and this situation proved it. The power shift isn't about fans being louder. It's about fans being informed. They're no longer satisfied with being told what to think about a player's future. They want evidence, they want consistency, and when they don't get it, they call it out. That's exactly what happened here. The more the media leaned into old talking points, the more the audience questioned their relevance. This growing gap forced the league's hand, because when fans stop trusting coverage, it becomes a business concern, not just a cultural one. Engagement changes, loyalty wobbles, and suddenly, the voices that used to shape everything don't hold the same authority. That's a dangerous moment for any organization built on storytelling as much as competition. In this case, fans weren't just reacting emotionally, they were identifying a pattern and refusing to let it slide quietly. And by doing that, they altered the trajectory of the story. What started as a one-sided narrative became a debate. What was supposed to fade into background noise turned into a spotlight. And once that spotlight hit, it exposed more than just questionable coverage. It exposed how much the balance of power has shifted. The media can still influence, but it no longer dictates. Fans now play an active role in deciding which stories survive and which ones collapse under scrutiny. And in the battle over Shedeur Sanders, that shift may be the most consequential development of all. This is the point where everything comes into focus, because what's happening here isn't just another heated debate that burns hot for a few weeks and then disappears. Moments like this either change how a league operates or confirm that nothing ever really does. And that's exactly why this situation matters far beyond Shedeur Sanders. The decisions made now, or avoided now, will quietly shape how the next wave of players are treated, long before fans ever see them on Sundays. If the reports and concerns circulating are accurate, this isn't about protecting one player from criticism, it's about protecting the integrity of evaluation itself. Development only works when opportunity exists. When those opportunities are selectively limited, especially at the most important position in sports, the league isn't just failing a player, it's distorting competition. A system can't claim fairness while outcomes are influenced before competition truly begins. What raises the stakes even higher is the precedent being hinted at. If a head coach's developmental choices can fall under league-level scrutiny, that changes the internal dynamics of every franchise. It forces uncomfortable self-examination, not just about what decisions are made, but why they're made. Are they really about merit or about comfort, familiarity, and narrative protection? That question is now hanging over front offices across the league. This moment also matters for the media, whether they want to admit it or not. There's a clear difference between analysis and amplification. When coverage crosses from critique into character framing without sufficient evidence, it stops informing and starts influencing. If this situation leads to even a small reset in how young quarterbacks are discussed, especially before they have real tape to answer critics, that's a meaningful shift, because reputations in the NFL are built early and they're incredibly hard to undo. For fans, this moment confirms something they felt for a long time, that storytelling in the NFL isn't neutral and that outcomes aren't always as organic as they're presented. Seeing the league
engaging with that reality, even partially, validates years of frustration. It tells fans their skepticism isn't paranoia, it's perception sharpened by experience. And for players watching from the sidelines or from college programs hoping to make the leap, this is a signal moment. They're paying attention to who gets protected, who gets patience, and who gets quietly pushed aside. They're watching to see whether performance actually dictates opportunity or whether labels still carry more weight than production. What happens next will inform how much trust the next generation places in the system they're entering. The danger for the NFL is letting this fade without action, because once you acknowledge a problem, silence becomes a statement. If nothing changes, if patterns repeat, this moment will be remembered not as progress, but as proof that even public pressure can't move the needle. That kind of disillusionment doesn't show up overnight. It erodes confidence slowly until fans stop believing in the fairness of the competition itself. But if the league follows through, if accountability becomes more than a talking point, this could mark a real turning point. Not a dramatic overhaul, but a recalibration. One that reinforces the idea that development must be earned through opportunity, not denied through assumption. One that reminds everyone involved that perception should follow performance, not replace it. That's why this matters, because this isn't about winning an argument or choosing sides. It's about whether the NFL is willing to confront the quiet mechanisms that decide careers before they really begin, and whether it's willing to prove, through action, that the league it presents on Sundays is built on fairness every other day of the week, too. When everything settles, this story won't be remembered for a quote, a headline, or even a single decision. It'll be remembered for what the league chose to do once the spotlight got uncomfortable, because this moment exposed something deeper than a rookie's depth chart status. It exposed how fragile the line is between development and dismissal, between evaluation and erasure. For Shedeur Sanders, this chapter is still being written. His career isn't defined yet, his ceiling hasn't been reached or rejected, but the forces around him have already shown how quickly perception can harden, how fast patience can disappear, and how easily a player's story can be shaped before performance ever gets a chance to speak. And that's the part that should give people pause. Because if this really were just about rookie growing pains, the conversation wouldn't feel this tense. If it were just about competition, it wouldn't require intervention. And if it were just about football, it wouldn't have forced the league to look in the mirror. The reason this situation lingers is because it touches something the NFL has long struggled to address honestly. Who gets time? Who gets protection? And who gets labeled early enough that escape becomes nearly impossible? What happens next will matter more than everything that's already happened. If accountability fades, if silence returns, the lesson learned won't be about fairness, it'll be about endurance, about waiting until the noise dies down and carrying on like nothing happened.
But if this leads to real introspection, real adjustments in how development and coverage intersect, then this moment becomes more than controversy. It becomes a benchmark. Fans already understand what's at stake. They've seen too many careers stall quietly to believe this is isolated. That's why they're watching so closely, not for vindication, but for evidence. Evidence that the league actually means what it says when it talks about opportunity and equity. Evidence that systems can evolve, not just react. This isn't a demand to lower standards or shield players from criticism. It's a demand for consistency, for patience to be earned through opportunity, not denied through assumption, for stories to follow results, not replace them. That's not radical, that's foundational. The NFL doesn't need to win this moment, it needs to learn from it, because the next talented quarterback is already on the way, and the question isn't whether the league will face this situation again, it's whether the next one will feel painfully familiar or finally meaningfully different.